The Enlightenment was a transformative period in European history, spanning roughly the 17th and 18th centuries. It was characterized by a surge in intellectual pursuits and a profound questioning of traditional authority, particularly in religion, politics, and science. Philosophers, writers, and thinkers sought to illuminate human understanding through reason, observation, and dialogue. Central to this movement was François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, whose prolific writings and unyielding advocacy for reason, freedom, and justice cemented his place as one of the Enlightenment's most prominent figures. The Enlightenment was not a monolithic movement, but rather a confluence of ideas that varied across nations and individuals. It was born from dissatisfaction with the rigid hierarchies of the medieval world, the dogmatic grip of the Catholic Church, and the unchecked power of monarchs. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Baron de Montesquieu contributed significantly to this intellectual revolution, but Voltaire's unique voice stood out. Through his wit, sharp critique, and tireless efforts to challenge oppressive systems, he became a beacon of Enlightenment ideals. Voltaire's importance in this era stemmed not only from his ideas, but also from his ability to communicate them effectively. His works were written in a clear and engaging style, making complex philosophical concepts accessible to a broad audience. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he mastered the art of satire and humor to critique powerful institutions, including the church and the state. This approach allowed his ideas to resonate far beyond the confines of academia, inspiring both the learned and the layperson. One of the defining characteristics of Voltaire's philosophy was his unwavering belief in the power of reason. He saw reason as the antidote to superstition and ignorance, which he believed were the root causes of human suffering. In his view, the Enlightenment was a moral imperative, an obligation to use intellect and evidence to challenge falsehoods, combat injustice, and improve society. His writings reflected this conviction, tackling issues such as religious intolerance, despotism, and the abuses of the judicial system. Voltaire was also a staunch advocate for freedom of expression, a principle that would later become a cornerstone of modern democracies. He believed that the free exchange of ideas was essential for progress, and that suppressing dissent stifled innovation and justice. This belief often put him at odds with the authorities of his time, resulting in imprisonment and exile. Yet, these adversities only strengthened his resolve and underscored the importance of the principles he championed. The Enlightenment was as much a cultural phenomenon as it was an intellectual one. It encompassed advancements in science, the arts, and literature, with Voltaire contributing significantly to all three. His writings, spanning plays, essays, novels, and historical analyses, reflected the Enlightenment's multidisciplinary nature. Voltaire demonstrated that reason and creativity were not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary forces that could drive humanity toward a better future. At the heart of Voltaire's significance was his relentless pursuit of truth and justice. He was unafraid to confront powerful institutions and call out their failings, even when it put his own safety at risk. Whether defending individuals wrongly accused of crimes, exposing the hypocrisy of religious authorities, or denouncing the excesses of monarchy, Voltaire consistently placed principles above personal gain. His courage and integrity made him a model for Enlightenment thinkers and future generations. The Enlightenment's impact on society was profound, reshaping institutions and inspiring revolutions, most notably in America and France. Voltaire's contributions were instrumental in this transformation. His works provided a blueprint for questioning authority and advocating for human rights, laying the groundwork for modern liberal thought. His emphasis on critical thinking and empirical evidence continues to influence contemporary discourse, highlighting the timeless relevance of his ideas. In understanding Voltaire's role in the Enlightenment, one must also recognize the challenges he faced. The era was fraught with resistance from those who sought to preserve traditional hierarchies and suppress dissent. Yet, Voltaire's ability to persevere and thrive in such an environment speaks to his resilience and the universal appeal of his message. His life and works exemplify the Enlightenment spirit, serving as a reminder of the power of reason and the enduring struggle for freedom and equality. Voltaire's legacy transcends his time, echoing through centuries as a testament to the transformative power of ideas. The Enlightenment, with its focus on reason, progress, and human dignity, would not have achieved its monumental impact without figures like him. As one of its most vocal and influential champions, Voltaire not only shaped the intellectual landscape of his era, but also laid the foundation for the values and principles that guide modern society. Voltaire's early life and education played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual powerhouse he would become. Born François-Marie Arouet on November 21, 1694, in Paris, he was the youngest of 5 children in a middle-class family. His father, François Arouet, was a notary, and his mother, Marie Marguerite Domart, came from a noble family. Though his upbringing was relatively comfortable, it was marked by tensions between his ambitions and the expectations of his family. These formative years set the stage for the rebellious and fiercely independent spirit that would define his life and work. From a young age, François-Marie displayed exceptional intelligence and a natural talent for language. After his mother's death when he was 7, he was sent to the prestigious Jesuit school College Louis-le-Grand in Paris. There, he received a classical education, excelling in Latin and rhetoric. The rigorous curriculum, rooted in the study of ancient texts, exposed him to the works of Virgil, Horace, and Cicero, which left a lasting impression on his literary style. While the Jesuits instilled discipline and a respect for learning, Voltaire's independent mind often clashed with their dogmatic teachings. It was during his school years that Voltaire developed his love for writing and began honing his wit. His talent for crafting poetry and sharp epigrams quickly earned him recognition among his peers. This penchant for satire would later become a defining feature of his work. However, his irreverence also brought him into conflict with authority figures. Even as a student, he questioned traditional beliefs and refused to accept ideas without evidence, foreshadowing his lifelong commitment to reason and skepticism. After completing his education, François-Marie faced pressure from his father to pursue a stable and respectable career. His father, a practical man, wanted him to become a lawyer. However, the young Voltaire had little interest in legal matters, preferring instead to immerse himself in literature and philosophy. To placate his father, he briefly studied law, but soon abandoned it to pursue his true passion, writing. This decision led to frequent arguments between father and son, highlighting the tension between societal expectations and individual aspirations, a theme that would resonate throughout Voltaire's life and works. Voltaire's early exposure to Parisian society also played a significant role in shaping his worldview. After leaving school, he became acquainted with influential members of the aristocracy and intellectual circles, gaining access to salons where ideas were freely exchanged. These gatherings provided him with opportunities to observe the social and political dynamics of his time. They also introduced him to Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas would influence his own, including the philosophy of rationalism and the emerging principles of individual liberty. Despite his burgeoning literary talent, Voltaire's irreverence often landed him in trouble. In 1717, at the age of 23, he was imprisoned in the Bastille for composing a satirical poem that mocked the French regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. The experience of imprisonment had a profound impact on him, reinforcing his disdain for absolute authority and inspiring him to use his pen as a tool for critique and reform. While in prison, he began work on his first major play, Oedipe, which would later establish him as a playwright of note. Voltaire's early education and literary pursuits revealed an individual deeply committed to the power of knowledge and the transformative potential of ideas. His classical training provided him with the tools to engage in intellectual debates, while his interactions with Parisian elites exposed him to the inequities and hypocrisies of society. These experiences shaped his belief in the necessity of reform, both in thought and in action, and set the foundation for his later critiques of religion, politics, and societal norms. The tension between conformity and rebellion was a recurring theme in Voltaire's life, and it first became apparent during these formative years. While his Jesuit education and exposure to aristocratic society provided him with opportunities, they also imposed constraints that he continuously sought to overcome. This struggle between tradition and innovation defined much of his early work and established him as a figure willing to challenge the status quo in pursuit of truth and justice. Voltaire's youth also revealed the beginnings of his lifelong fascination with human nature and its contradictions. His ability to observe and analyze people's behavior allowed him to craft characters and narratives that captured the complexities of human experience. These skills would later be evident in works like Candide and Zadig, which combined sharp social commentary with a profound understanding of human folly and resilience. By the time Voltaire entered his 20s, he was already showing signs of the brilliance and boldness that would define his legacy. His early life and education were marked by a relentless pursuit of knowledge and a refusal to accept limitations imposed by tradition or authority. These traits not only set him apart from his peers, but also prepared him to become one of the most influential voices of the Enlightenment. The transition from François-Marie Arouet to Voltaire marked a pivotal moment in the life of one of history's most celebrated intellectuals. This transformation was not merely a change of name, but a deliberate act of self-reinvention that signified his rejection of the constraints imposed by his birth and upbringing. By adopting the name Voltaire, François-Marie symbolized his aspiration to forge a new identity, free from the expectations of his family and the conventions of his time. This chapter explores how Voltaire's pen name and early writings set the stage for his emergence as a towering figure in literature and philosophy. The origins of the name Voltaire remain a subject of debate among historians. Some suggest it was an anagram of Arouet le Jeune, Arouet the Younger, while others believe it derived from the Latinized version of a family estate, Voltaire. Whatever its precise etymology, the name became synonymous with wit, critique, and intellectual daring. By adopting it, Voltaire distanced himself from his father's expectations and claimed his autonomy as a writer. The decision reflected his growing awareness of the power of words to shape identity and influence society. Voltaire's early literary career began in the shadow of controversy. After his release from the Bastille in 1718, he achieved his first significant success with the play Oedipe. The tragedy, rooted in classical themes, was a triumph and established him as a playwright of repute. Its success not only showcased his talent for blending traditional forms with innovative ideas, but also signaled his arrival in Parisian literary circles. Oedipe exemplified his ability to adapt timeless narratives to contemporary contexts, a skill that would define much of his later work. Building on this success, Voltaire began to explore other literary forms, including poetry, essays, and historical writing. His poem of the League, later retitled Henriade, was an epic that celebrated religious tolerance and critiqued the fanaticism of his era. Written in the style of Virgil and Homer, it combined classical influences with Enlightenment ideals. This work, while celebrated for its artistry, also revealed his willingness to address controversial topics, a hallmark of his career. Voltaire's early writings often straddled the line between art and activism. While his plays and poems entertained audiences, they also carried implicit critiques of authority and tradition. His wit and mastery of satire became powerful tools for exposing hypocrisy and injustice. In doing so, he demonstrated that literature could serve not only as a means of aesthetic expression, but also as a vehicle for social and political critique. This dual purpose became a defining characteristic of his oeuvre. Despite his growing fame, Voltaire's sharp tongue frequently landed him in trouble. In 1726, after a dispute with the powerful nobleman Chevalier de Rohan, he was beaten and humiliated. When Voltaire sought legal redress, he found himself imprisoned once again in the Bastille. This episode underscored the risks of challenging the established order, but also reinforced his resolve to speak out against injustice. Exiled to England shortly thereafter, he would find new sources of inspiration and intellectual growth that further shaped his ideas. Voltaire's exile in England was a transformative period in his life. There, he encountered a society that, while imperfect, embodied many of the ideals he admired: religious tolerance, constitutional monarchy, and a vibrant intellectual culture. He became acquainted with the works of John Locke and Isaac Newton, whose ideas on empiricism and natural philosophy greatly influenced his thinking. Voltaire's exposure to the relative freedoms of English society contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchies of France and deepened his commitment to reform. During this time, Voltaire began work on philosophical letters, also known as Letters Concerning the English Nation, a series of essays that praised English society and critiqued French institutions. Published in 1734, the work was banned in France and burned publicly, but it solidified his reputation as a fearless critic of orthodoxy. In these letters, Voltaire used his characteristic wit and clarity to advocate for freedom of thought, religious tolerance, and the separation of powers, ideas that would become central to the Enlightenment. While his exile in England expanded his intellectual horizons, it also highlighted the precarious position of writers who dared to challenge authority. Voltaire's experiences during this period demonstrated the power of ideas to transcend borders, but also the dangers of confronting entrenched systems of power. These lessons shaped his approach to writing, motivating him to use satire and allegory as tools for critique while navigating the risks of censorship and persecution. By the time Voltaire returned to France in 1729, he had emerged as a mature writer and thinker with a clear sense of purpose. His early successes and struggles had taught him the power of language to effect change, and his time in England had broadened his intellectual perspective. The name Voltaire, once a symbol of youthful rebellion, now represented a voice of reason and reform. As he began the next phase of his career, he was poised to become one of the most influential figures of his age, shaping the Enlightenment through his relentless pursuit of truth and justice. The periods of imprisonment and exile in Voltaire's early career were pivotal in shaping his philosophy and approach to life. Far from silencing him, these experiences strengthened his resolve to challenge injustice and advocate for reason, tolerance, and freedom. The punishments he endured for his outspoken views highlighted the oppressive nature of the French Ancien regime, while his time in England exposed him to new ideas that profoundly influenced his thought. These formative years not only shaped Voltaire's intellectual identity, but also cemented his role as a leading voice of the Enlightenment. Voltaire's first major brush with authority came in 1717, when he was imprisoned in the Bastille for composing satirical verses that mocked the French regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. The young writer's wit and sharp critique made him an immediate target of those in power, but the experience did not break his spirit. Instead, his imprisonment provided him with time to reflect and to write. During this period, he began work on Oedipe, the play that would later launch his literary career. The confinement also taught him a valuable lesson about the risks of speaking truth to power, which he would navigate with greater finesse in the years to come. Despite his growing success as a playwright and poet, Voltaire's penchant for satire continued to bring him into conflict with the authorities. In 1726, a confrontation with the Chevalier de Rohan, a nobleman who insulted Voltaire's lower social standing, escalated into a public altercation. Voltaire's retaliatory wit enraged Rohan, who arranged for him to be beaten by hired men. When Voltaire sought legal recourse, the situation backfired, and he was imprisoned once again in the Bastille. This second imprisonment underscored the precariousness of his position as a writer who dared to challenge the aristocracy. Following his release, Voltaire was given a choice: face indefinite imprisonment or go into exile. He chose the latter and departed for England in 1726. Although forced, this exile proved to be one of the most transformative periods of his life. England, with its constitutional monarchy, relative religious tolerance, and vibrant intellectual culture, provided a stark contrast to the absolutism and rigid hierarchies of France. Voltaire's years in England exposed him to ideas and practices that would profoundly influence his philosophy. During his time in England, Voltaire immersed himself in the works of prominent thinkers such as John Locke, whose ideas on empiricism and natural rights challenged traditional notions of authority and knowledge. He also admired the scientific advancements of Isaac Newton, whose laws of nature exemplified the power of reason and observation. These influences reinforced Voltaire's belief in the importance of critical thinking and evidence-based inquiry, which became central to his own intellectual pursuits. Voltaire's observations of English society extended beyond philosophy and science. He was particularly struck by the relative freedom of the press and the parliamentary system, which provided a framework for governance that contrasted sharply with the absolute monarchy of France. This exposure deepened his commitment to advocating for political reform and individual freedoms. His admiration for these English institutions was later expressed in his Philosophical Letters, 1734, a work that celebrated the virtues of English society while critiquing French despotism and religious intolerance. The publication of the Philosophical Letters marked a turning point in Voltaire's career. While the work was praised in some circles, it was banned in France and publicly burned by the authorities. The reaction demonstrated the extent to which Voltaire's ideas challenged the status quo and posed a threat to the established order. The controversy only heightened his determination to use his pen as a weapon against ignorance and oppression, solidifying his role as a dissident intellectual. Exile, however, was not without its hardships. While in England, Voltaire struggled with financial difficulties and the challenges of living as a foreigner. Yet, these struggles also shaped his resilience and adaptability. He mastered the English language, allowing him to engage directly with English texts and thinkers, and he used his wit and charm to build connections in intellectual circles. By the time he returned to France in 1729, he was a more seasoned writer and thinker, ready to take on new challenges. Voltaire's time in exile also deepened his understanding of the interconnectedness of culture and politics. He realized that ideas could cross borders and that intellectual movements were not confined to individual nations. This realization reinforced his belief in the universality of reason and the shared humanity of all people. It also motivated him to become a bridge between French and English thought, introducing Enlightenment ideas to a broader audience. By the time Voltaire returned to France, he was no longer the young poet who had first been imprisoned for his irreverence. His experiences of imprisonment and exile had matured him, broadening his intellectual horizons and strengthening his resolve. These formative years were a crucible in which his identity as Voltaire, the fearless critic, the champion of reason, and the advocate for justice, was forged. They set the stage for the extraordinary contributions he would make to the Enlightenment and to the broader struggle for human freedom and dignity. Voltaire's critique of religion and exploration of philosophy were cornerstones of his intellectual legacy. Throughout his life, he was deeply concerned with the oppressive power of organized religion and its impact on human freedom and progress. While he was not an atheist, Voltaire advocated for deism, a belief in a rational, non-interventionist God, and fiercely opposed religious fanaticism, dogma, and institutional corruption. His philosophical writings reflect a profound commitment to reason, tolerance, and the betterment of society, making him one of the Enlightenment's most influential voices on these matters. At the heart of Voltaire's critique was his disdain for religious intolerance. He believed that religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, were often complicit in perpetuating ignorance, oppression, and violence. This perspective was shaped by events such as the persecution of Protestants in France and the infamous Calas affair, in which a Protestant merchant was wrongly accused of murdering his son to prevent a Catholic conversion. Voltaire's defense of Jean Calas, detailed in his treatise on tolerance, showcased his dedication to justice and his belief in the need for religious coexistence. Voltaire's philosophy of deism stood in stark contrast to the dogmatic teachings of organized religion. He rejected the idea of a God who intervenes in human affairs or demands adherence to rigid doctrines. Instead, he envisioned a rational creator who set the universe in motion and left it to operate according to natural laws. This perspective aligned with the scientific discoveries of his time, particularly the work of Isaac Newton, and emphasized the compatibility of faith with reason. For Voltaire, deism offered a way to reconcile spirituality with Enlightenment principles. One of Voltaire's most famous critiques of religion appears in his satirical novella Candide, 1759. In this work, he ridicules the optimistic philosophy of Leibniz, which argued that humanity lives in the best of all possible worlds. Through the misfortunes of the protagonist, Candide, Voltaire exposes the absurdity of this belief and highlights the hypocrisy and cruelty often justified in the name of religion. The novella's humor and biting social commentary made it a cornerstone of Enlightenment literature and a powerful critique of blind faith. Voltaire's skepticism of religious authority extended to his views on scripture and theology. He argued that sacred texts should be subject to the same scrutiny as any other historical document. In works such as the Philosophical Dictionary and the Sermon of the 50, he dissected biblical narratives and criticized their inconsistencies, moral ambiguities, and historical inaccuracies. This approach reflected his broader commitment to reason and evidence as the foundations of knowledge, challenging the notion that religious beliefs should be exempt from critical examination. While Voltaire's critique of religion was uncompromising, it was not rooted in a rejection of spirituality or morality. He acknowledged the value of religion in providing ethical guidance and fostering social cohesion, but insisted that these functions should not come at the expense of individual freedom or intellectual inquiry. He believed that a rational approach to morality, grounded in empathy and universal principles, could achieve the same goals without the need for dogma or superstition. Voltaire's writings on religion often provoked strong reactions, both positive and negative. His supporters lauded him as a champion of reason and human rights, while his detractors accused him of blasphemy and atheism. These controversies underscored the radical nature of his ideas in a society where religious authority was deeply entrenched. Despite the risks, Voltaire remained steadfast in his mission to challenge oppressive systems and promote Enlightenment values. Central to Voltaire's philosophy was his belief in the power of education to combat ignorance and intolerance. He argued that many of the evils attributed to religion stem not from faith itself, but from a lack of understanding and critical thinking. By promoting education and encouraging dialogue, he hoped to create a more informed and tolerant society. This emphasis on education as a tool for progress resonated with broader Enlightenment ideals and remains relevant in modern debates about the role of religion in public life. Voltaire's critique of religion was closely tied to his broader political philosophy. He saw the alliance between church and state as a primary source of oppression and corruption, arguing that the two institutions reinforced each other's power at the expense of individual liberty. His call for the separation of church and state was revolutionary for its time and laid the groundwork for modern secularism. Voltaire's insistence on the importance of freedom of conscience continues to influence discussions about the relationship between religion and government. In the end, Voltaire's critique of religion was not merely an attack on faith, but a defense of reason, freedom, and human dignity. He sought to liberate individuals from the constraints of dogma and empower them to think for themselves. His philosophy championed a vision of humanity guided by knowledge, compassion, and a commitment to progress. Through his fearless critique of religious institutions and his unwavering advocacy for tolerance, Voltaire left an enduring legacy that continues to inspire debates about faith, reason, and the pursuit of truth. Voltaire's enduring legacy as an Enlightenment thinker is inextricably linked to his relentless advocacy for civil liberties. He championed freedom of thought, expression, and religion, and stood firmly against injustice, oppression, and inequality. These ideals were not only central to his philosophy, but also manifest in his actions and writings. Through his works and public campaigns, Voltaire became a tireless defender of the individual's right to autonomy and dignity in the face of arbitrary authority. One of the most significant aspects of Voltaire's fight for civil liberties was his advocacy for freedom of speech. He famously declared, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a sentiment that epitomizes the Enlightenment belief in open dialogue and the free exchange of ideas. For Voltaire, the ability to speak and write freely was essential for progress and the pursuit of truth. His defense of free speech was not limited to theory. He consistently challenged censorship and used his own writings to expose hypocrisy and corruption. Voltaire also championed religious freedom, a radical stance in an era when religious intolerance was deeply entrenched in European societies. He criticized the Catholic Church for its role in perpetuating persecution and injustice, while also opposing the legal and social barriers faced by Protestants, Jews, and other religious minorities. His treatise on tolerance, 1763, written in response to the wrongful execution of Jean Calas, is a landmark work that calls for religious coexistence and an end to sectarian violence. In this text, Voltaire argued that tolerance is not only a moral imperative, but also a practical necessity for social harmony. His commitment to justice was further evident in his involvement in high-profile legal cases, which he used as platforms to challenge abuses of power. In addition to the Calas affair, Voltaire took up the case of Servin, another Protestant family accused of murder under dubious circumstances. He also defended the Chevalier de la Barre, a young nobleman who was executed for allegedly desecrating a crucifix. In each case, Voltaire sought to expose the flaws in the judicial system and to demand accountability from those in positions of authority. His advocacy often drew attention to the broader societal and institutional injustices that these cases represented. Voltaire's support for civil liberties extended beyond religious and legal matters to include critiques of economic inequality and feudal privilege. He was deeply critical of the aristocracy's monopoly on power and wealth, which he saw as a source of widespread suffering and stagnation. In his writings, he called for reforms that would reduce the concentration of power and promote meritocracy. While Voltaire was not a revolutionary in the sense of advocating for the overthrow of the existing order, he believed in gradual progress through reason and reform. Education was another cornerstone of Voltaire's vision for civil liberties. He argued that ignorance was a primary driver of oppression and that widespread education was essential for fostering critical thinking and informed citizenship. Voltaire's emphasis on education as a means of empowerment reflected his belief in the potential of individuals to improve themselves and their societies. By equipping people with knowledge, he hoped to create a world where reason could prevail over superstition and prejudice. The right to a fair and impartial judiciary was also central to Voltaire's advocacy. He recognized that without legal protections, other civil liberties could not be effectively safeguarded. His critiques of judicial corruption and arbitrary punishment were aimed at creating a system where justice was blind to class, religion, and political influence. Voltaire's vision of the rule of law was closely tied to his broader commitment to individual rights and equality before the law. Voltaire's fight for civil liberties was not without its challenges. His outspoken views often made him a target of persecution, and he spent much of his life in conflict with the authorities. He was exiled multiple times, his works were censored, and his writings were burned. Despite these obstacles, Voltaire's resilience and determination ensured that his ideas continued to reach a wide audience. His ability to use wit and satire to critique power made his works both impactful and accessible, cementing his influence on generations to come. The impact of Voltaire's advocacy for civil liberties extended far beyond his lifetime. His ideas laid the groundwork for many of the freedoms that are considered fundamental in modern democracies. The principles he championed, freedom of thought, expression, and religion, the rule of law, and the importance of education, remain cornerstones of human rights discourse. Voltaire's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of reason and the written word in the fight for justice. Ultimately, Voltaire's unwavering commitment to civil liberties reflected his belief in the inherent dignity and potential of every individual. He understood that the progress of society depended on the ability of its members to think and act freely, unencumbered by the constraints of dogma and oppression. Through his writings, campaigns, and personal courage, Voltaire not only shaped the Enlightenment, but also inspired future generations to continue the struggle for freedom and equality. His vision of a world governed by reason and justice remains an aspirational ideal, underscoring the timeless relevance of his work. Voltaire's intellectual achievements were not confined to philosophy, literature, and social critique. He also made significant contributions to the realms of science and historiography. Though not a scientist himself, Voltaire championed scientific inquiry and sought to popularize the discoveries of the Enlightenment's greatest minds. His historical writings, meanwhile, broke with traditional approaches, laying the groundwork for modern historiography. In both fields, Voltaire demonstrated his commitment to reason, evidence, and the pursuit of truth. Voltaire's interest in science was largely inspired by his time in England, where he encountered the work of Sir Isaac Newton. Newton's Principia Mathematica and his theories of gravitation and motion profoundly influenced Voltaire's worldview. He admired Newton's reliance on empirical evidence and logical reasoning, which he saw as a model for all intellectual endeavors. In collaboration with his companion Émilie du Châtelet, a brilliant scientist in her own right, Voltaire sought to make Newtonian physics accessible to a broader audience. Their joint work, Elements of Newton's Philosophy, was one of the first attempts to explain Newton's theories in layman's terms. By translating and interpreting Newton's ideas for a French audience, Voltaire played a crucial role in spreading scientific knowledge and challenging outdated paradigms. In particular, he used Newtonian physics to refute the Cartesian worldview that still held sway in France. This effort was not merely academic. Voltaire believed that science could illuminate the workings of nature and free humanity from ignorance and superstition. His advocacy for Newton's ideas reflected his broader commitment to the Enlightenment principles of reason and progress. Voltaire's engagement with science also extended to broader questions about the relationship between science and religion. He argued that scientific discoveries revealed the magnificence of a rational universe, governed by natural laws rather than divine intervention. This perspective reinforced his deist beliefs, which emphasized a non-interventionist creator. Voltaire's writings on science often contained implicit critiques of religious dogma, highlighting the compatibility of reason and spirituality while opposing the rigid doctrines of organized religion. Parallel to his contributions to science, Voltaire revolutionized historical writing. Traditional historiography in his time often focused on the deeds of monarchs, battles, and religious events, treating history as a moral or theological narrative. Voltaire, however, sought to create a more secular, analytical approach to history that emphasized the cultural, social, and intellectual forces shaping human civilization. His groundbreaking work, The Age of Louis XIV, exemplifies this new perspective, offering a comprehensive examination of the political, artistic, and scientific achievements of the period. In The Age of Louis XIV, Voltaire pioneered the use of cultural and intellectual developments as key elements of historical analysis. He treated history not as a series of divine interventions, but as a human endeavor shaped by reason, ambition, and creativity. This approach allowed him to highlight the contributions of philosophers, scientists, and artists alongside those of kings and generals. By doing so, Voltaire expanded the scope of historiography and set a precedent for future historians to examine the broader context of human achievement. Voltaire's essay on the manners and spirit of nations further exemplified his innovative approach to history. In this work, he sought to provide a global perspective on the development of human societies, examining cultures outside of Europe and exploring the interconnectedness of civilizations. Although his understanding of non-European societies was often limited and shaped by the biases of his time, Voltaire's attempt to adopt a more inclusive perspective marked an important step toward a more comprehensive and comparative approach to history. A defining feature of Voltaire's historiography was his insistence on the use of primary sources and critical analysis. He rejected the uncritical acceptance of tradition and myth, advocating instead for a rigorous examination of evidence. This methodology reflected his broader Enlightenment values, emphasizing reason and skepticism as tools for uncovering truth. Voltaire's historical works often challenged conventional narratives, exposing inaccuracies and questioning the motivations of historical actors. Despite his groundbreaking contributions, Voltaire's approach to science and historiography was not without flaws. His writings sometimes reflected the Eurocentric and class biases of his time, and his emphasis on reason occasionally led him to dismiss the emotional and spiritual dimensions of human experience. Nevertheless, his work laid important foundations for the development of modern science communication and historical scholarship. His insistence on evidence-based inquiry and his recognition of the cultural dimensions of history remain influential to this day. Voltaire's efforts to popularize science and reform historiography were driven by his belief in the transformative power of knowledge. He saw science as a means of liberating humanity from ignorance and history as a tool for understanding and improving the present. By bridging the gap between academic disciplines and public discourse, Voltaire made the ideas of the Enlightenment accessible to a broader audience. His contributions to these fields reflect his unwavering commitment to reason, progress, and the betterment of humanity. In both science and historiography, Voltaire demonstrated the same qualities that defined his broader intellectual legacy: a sharp mind, a fearless willingness to challenge orthodoxy, and an unrelenting pursuit of truth. His work in these areas not only enriched the intellectual landscape of his time, but also continues to inspire thinkers and educators around the world. Through his dedication to reason and his belief in the power of ideas, Voltaire left an indelible mark on the fields of science and history, advancing the cause of enlightenment for generations to come. Satire was one of Voltaire's most powerful tools in his fight against ignorance, oppression, and hypocrisy. Through humor, irony, and exaggeration, he exposed the flaws of society, challenged entrenched beliefs, and critiqued the powerful institutions of his time. His satirical works were not merely literary exercises, but potent instruments of social and political critique, enabling him to address controversial topics in ways that were accessible to a broad audience. In doing so, Voltaire cemented his reputation as one of the Enlightenment's most fearless and incisive critics. Voltaire's most celebrated satirical work, Candide 1759, is a masterful critique of optimism, religion, and the human condition. The novella follows the misadventures of its naive protagonist, Candide, and his unwavering tutor, Pangloss, who espouses the philosophy of Leibnizian optimism, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Through a series of absurd and often tragic events, Voltaire systematically dismantles this philosophy, revealing the cruelty, irrationality, and suffering that characterize the real world. The biting humor of Candide underscores the absurdity of blind optimism, while encouraging readers to confront the complexities of life with reason and pragmatism. Religion is a frequent target of Voltaire's satire, as he sought to expose the hypocrisy and corruption of organized faith. In works like Candide and the Philosophical Dictionary, he lampooned the clergy's moral failings, the superstitions propagated by religious institutions, and the destructive consequences of fanaticism. These critiques were not limited to Christianity. Voltaire scrutinized religious practices and beliefs across cultures, always advocating for tolerance and the separation of religion from public life. His satire aimed to provoke reflection and reform rather than outright rejection of spirituality. Voltaire also used satire to critique the political structures of his time, particularly the absolute monarchy and the feudal system. He ridiculed the incompetence and excesses of the aristocracy, portraying them as barriers to progress and justice. In his plays, pamphlets, and essays, he highlighted the absurdities of courtly life, the abuses of power, and the inequities faced by the lower classes. By presenting these critiques with humor and wit, Voltaire disarmed his opponents and made his points more palatable to a wider audience. Another recurring theme in Voltaire's satire was his opposition to war and its attendant horrors. In Candide, for example, he portrays the brutality and futility of conflict through vivid and grotesque imagery. This anti-war sentiment reflected Voltaire's broader belief in the value of human life and the need for diplomacy and reason to resolve disputes. His satirical critiques of war served as poignant reminders of the human cost of violence and the moral failings of those who perpetuate it. Voltaire's mastery of satire extended to his exploration of social conventions and human behavior. He used humor to reveal the contradictions and follies of societal norms, from romantic idealizations to the pursuit of wealth and status. His works often feature characters who embody these contradictions, allowing readers to see themselves and their world more clearly. By holding up a mirror to society, Voltaire encouraged introspection and inspired change. Despite its humor, Voltaire's satire was not without risk. His sharp critiques often provoked powerful enemies, from church leaders to political figures. Many of his works were banned, censored, or published anonymously to avoid persecution. Yet, Voltaire's persistence and clever use of allegory and ambiguity allowed him to navigate these dangers while continuing to challenge authority. His ability to veil his critiques in entertaining narratives made his ideas more difficult to suppress and ensured their lasting impact. Voltaire's use of satire was grounded in his belief in the potential of human reason and progress. He saw humor as a way to disarm resistance and open minds to new ideas. By making his critiques engaging and accessible, he hoped to educate and inspire his readers, encouraging them to question established norms and seek improvements in their own lives and societies. His satire was not simply an attack on the status quo, but a call to action for a more enlightened world. The enduring appeal of Voltaire's satirical works lies in their universality and relevance. Though written in the context of 18th century Europe, his critiques of hypocrisy, dogma, and power resonate with readers across cultures and eras. His humor transcends the specifics of time and place, offering timeless insights into the human condition. As such, Voltaire's satire continues to inspire writers, thinkers, and activists who seek to use wit and creativity as tools for social change. In the end, Voltaire's mastery of satire reflects his larger vision as a thinker and writer, to challenge, provoke, and illuminate. His works remind us that humor can be a powerful weapon against ignorance and oppression, capable of reaching audiences in ways that more direct critiques cannot. Through his wit and wisdom, Voltaire demonstrated that even the most entrenched injustices could be confronted with a sharp mind and a sharp pen, leaving an indelible mark on the Enlightenment and the ongoing struggle for truth and justice. Voltaire's intellectual legacy is deeply intertwined with the Enlightenment ideal of progress, a belief that human beings, through the application of reason, science, and education, could improve both their individual lives and their societies. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Voltaire did not advocate for radical political revolution, but rather for gradual reform. His belief in progress was rooted in the notion that humanity could, through rational thought, overcome ignorance, superstition, and tyranny, moving towards a more just, rational, and enlightened world. At the heart of Voltaire's vision of progress was his unwavering belief in the power of reason. He was convinced that reason could guide human beings toward better lives by dispelling the darkness of superstition and ignorance that had long shaped society. His critique of the prevailing religious and political systems of his time was driven by a desire to free people from the constraints imposed by these institutions. In Voltaire's view, an enlightened individual was one who used reason to make informed decisions and who valued personal freedom over tradition and dogma. Voltaire's commitment to reason was accompanied by a profound belief in the importance of education. For him, education was the key to unlocking human potential and facilitating progress. He advocated for educational reforms that would promote critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and tolerance. Voltaire was deeply critical of the traditional education system, which he saw as outdated, dogmatic, and inadequate in preparing individuals to engage with the complexities of the modern world. He believed that true education should empower individuals to think for themselves, challenge established beliefs, and contribute to society's advancement. One of Voltaire's most significant contributions to the idea of progress was his advocacy for religious tolerance. His treatise on tolerance, 1763, is a seminal work in this regard, arguing that religious intolerance was one of the greatest impediments to human progress. Voltaire saw religious conflict and persecution as examples of the destructive power of blind faith. By promoting religious freedom and calling for the separation of church and state, he believed that society could foster greater harmony and allow individuals to live in accordance with their conscience. In his view, religious tolerance was not just a moral imperative, but also a necessary condition for societal progress. In addition to religious tolerance, Voltaire's vision of progress included the expansion of civil liberties and human rights. He was an outspoken advocate for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the protection of individual rights. These principles were fundamental to his belief in progress because they allowed for the free exchange of ideas, the correction of societal injustices, and the ability to challenge corrupt or oppressive governments. Voltaire's sharp criticisms of absolute monarchy, particularly his disdain for figures like Louis XIV and other despotic rulers, reflected his belief that political power should be accountable to the people and that rulers should be constrained by the rule of law. Voltaire's belief in progress also led him to challenge the traditional social hierarchies that dominated Europe at the time. While he was not an advocate for radical social upheaval, he believed that societies should be structured in ways that promoted fairness, equality, and merit. In his writings, he criticized the hereditary nobility and the aristocracy's privileges, which he saw as obstacles to social and economic advancement. Voltaire's commitment to meritocracy, in which individuals could rise or fall based on their abilities rather than their birth, was a key aspect of his vision for a more progressive society. A significant part of Voltaire's conception of progress was the application of scientific knowledge to solve practical problems. He was a staunch advocate for the scientific method and believed that the advances in science and technology of the Enlightenment could improve the human condition. Voltaire was particularly influenced by the work of Isaac Newton, whose laws of motion and universal gravitation provided a model for understanding the natural world in rational, empirical terms. Voltaire's promotion of Newtonian physics was not just an academic exercise. He saw science as a means of liberating humanity from the constraints of superstition and ignorance, empowering people to understand and control their environment. However, Voltaire was not naive about the challenges to progress. He recognized that the road to enlightenment and reform was fraught with obstacles, many of which were deeply entrenched in society. He was keenly aware of the power of ignorance and tradition, which often stood in the way of reason and progress. Despite these challenges, Voltaire remained committed to the idea that gradual change was possible, and he worked tirelessly through his writings and public campaigns to encourage such change. His works, such as Candide, Letters on England, and Philosophical Dictionary, became instruments of intellectual transformation, encouraging readers to question outdated beliefs and to consider new, more rational approaches to society and governance. Voltaire's conception of progress was not limited to abstract ideals. It was rooted in his desire to make tangible improvements in the world. He believed that the accumulation of knowledge and the spread of Enlightenment ideas could lead to practical reforms in law, government, and society. Voltaire's calls for legal reforms, including his advocacy for justice in high-profile cases like the Calas affair and the Servant affair, were part of his broader effort to create a more just society. He believed that a more rational and humane approach to justice, free from religious prejudice and political corruption, was essential for the progress of civilization. Voltaire's vision of progress was not without its critics, particularly those who believed in the virtues of tradition or who feared the social consequences of radical change. Some saw his advocacy for reform as dangerous or destabilizing, while others were critical of his rejection of religious orthodoxy. Yet Voltaire's contributions to the idea of progress remain foundational to modern liberal thought. His emphasis on reason, education, civil liberties, and scientific inquiry shaped the intellectual currents of his time and left a lasting imprint on the political and philosophical movements that followed. In conclusion, Voltaire's belief in progress was integral to his broader philosophical vision. His commitment to reason, education, civil liberties, and scientific inquiry made him a leading figure in the Enlightenment movement and a tireless advocate for social, political, and intellectual reform. While he may not have envisioned a utopian future, Voltaire saw progress as a continuous, iterative process, one in which human beings could, through reason and effort, create a more just, rational, and enlightened world. His work continues to resonate today, reminding us that progress is not inevitable, but must be actively pursued through critical thought, open discourse, and a commitment to human dignity. Voltaire's legacy, cemented through his intellectual contributions to philosophy, literature, and social criticism, continues to shape contemporary thought and culture. As one of the central figures of the Enlightenment, Voltaire's influence permeated a wide range of fields, from political philosophy and human rights to science, education, and the arts. His advocacy for reason, tolerance, freedom of expression, and the pursuit of knowledge laid the foundations for many of the democratic and liberal values that define the modern world. In this final chapter, we will explore Voltaire's lasting impact on subsequent generations and his place in the intellectual history of the West. At the heart of Voltaire's legacy is his unwavering commitment to reason and rational inquiry. His critiques of religious dogma, political tyranny, and social injustice were grounded in the belief that human beings, through the use of reason, could transform society and improve their lives. In the centuries following his death, Voltaire's ideas became central to the intellectual development of the modern Western world. His skepticism of authority, particularly religious and political authority, inspired countless thinkers and movements that sought to challenge oppressive systems and promote individual freedoms. Voltaire's advocacy for freedom of speech and the press remains one of his most enduring contributions. He is often associated with the famous maxim, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This defense of free expression was not just a philosophical stance, but a call to action, urging individuals to challenge prevailing ideas and engage in open discourse. In the centuries since Voltaire's time, his championing of free speech has become a cornerstone of liberal democracies, enshrined in legal frameworks such as the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and similar protections in other democratic nations. The idea of religious tolerance, central to Voltaire's philosophy, also has had a profound influence on the development of modern political thought. His critique of religious intolerance, exemplified in works like Treatise on Tolerance, was a direct challenge to the religious wars and persecutions that had plagued Europe for centuries. By advocating for the separation of church and state, Voltaire helped lay the intellectual groundwork for secular governance, in which religion would not dominate public life or interfere with individual rights. This principle is now a fundamental aspect of many contemporary political systems, particularly in the West, where the protection of religious freedom is a core value. In addition to his contributions to political and religious thought, Voltaire's advocacy for human rights, particularly the rights of the individual, left a lasting mark on the development of modern liberalism. His criticisms of absolute monarchy, aristocratic privilege, and social inequality foreshadowed the democratic revolutions that would sweep across Europe and the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Voltaire's emphasis on civil liberties, including the right to a fair trial, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, and freedom of conscience, laid the foundation for the modern human rights movement. His works continue to be cited by those who fight for political freedoms and social justice worldwide. Voltaire's influence also extended to the field of historiography, where he transformed the way history was written and understood. Prior to Voltaire, historical narratives were often dominated by religious or monarchic perspectives, focusing on the actions of rulers and the divine will. Voltaire, however, sought to provide a more secular, analytical approach to history, emphasizing the importance of human agency and the interplay of social, political, and intellectual forces. His works, such as The Age of Louis XIV and The Philosophical Dictionary, demonstrated a commitment to critical thinking and the use of evidence to understand the past. Voltaire's historical methodology, which questioned established narratives and sought to illuminate the complexities of human experience, influenced the development of modern historical scholarship. In the realm of science, Voltaire's enthusiastic promotion of the scientific method and Newtonian physics contributed to the growing popularity of empirical inquiry. Although Voltaire was not a scientist himself, his efforts to popularize the works of figures like Isaac Newton and his emphasis on rationality helped to foster an environment in which science could flourish. Voltaire's writings on science, particularly in his Letters on England, introduced the French and broader European intellectual circles to the latest developments in science and philosophy. His ability to communicate complex scientific ideas in accessible language made science more widely understood and appreciated, helping to lay the groundwork for the later achievements of the scientific revolution. Voltaire's contributions to literature, particularly his use of satire, also had a lasting impact on the development of Western literary traditions. His wit, humor, and sharp criticism of societal norms made him a master of satire, and his works, particularly Candide, continue to be regarded as some of the greatest examples of the genre. Through his biting critiques of religious and political institutions, Voltaire used literature as a vehicle for social change, demonstrating the power of the written word to challenge authority and provoke thought. His influence can be seen in the works of later satirists, from Jonathan Swift to George Orwell, who, like Voltaire, used humor and irony to expose societal flaws. Voltaire's ideas also had a profound influence on the French Revolution, despite the fact that he did not live to see its occurrence. His critiques of absolute monarchy, his belief in individual rights, and his advocacy for secularism and religious tolerance were adopted by many of the revolutionaries who sought to overthrow the old regime. Although Voltaire was not a revolutionary in the strictest sense, his writings inspired many of the Enlightenment ideals that would shape the political landscape of post-revolutionary France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was a foundational document of the French Revolution, echoed many of Voltaire's principles, particularly his emphasis on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Despite his immense contributions, Voltaire's ideas were not without their critics. Some argued that his disdain for organized religion and his skepticism toward the masses made him an elitist who was indifferent to the suffering of ordinary people. Others believed that his emphasis on reason and progress overlooked the importance of tradition, emotion, and spiritual values. Nevertheless, Voltaire's legacy endures because of his commitment to challenging authority, his advocacy for individual freedoms, and his belief in the power of reason to improve society. His writings continue to inspire intellectuals, activists, and thinkers who seek to create a more just, rational, and humane world. In conclusion, Voltaire's intellectual legacy is both vast and enduring. His contributions to philosophy, literature, politics, science, and human rights have shaped the course of modern thought and continue to influence contemporary debates on freedom, equality, and justice. Voltaire's life and work stand as a testament to the power of reason, wit, and critical inquiry in the pursuit of a more enlightened society. Through his relentless challenge to ignorance, superstition, and tyranny, Voltaire remains a central figure in the intellectual history of the West and a beacon of Enlightenment ideals for future generations.